Welcome back to Stop Mixing Sense. Today we are going to place a bunch of instruments along the Kiki Bouba spectrum and talk about what it all means, or what it could mean. If you don't know what the Kiki Bouba spectrum is, please go back and watch my first video and then second video, and this will make a lot more sense. So here we have the frequency spectrum, and it should be pretty obvious which side of the frequency spectrum is Kiki and which one is Bouba, just from this still image alone, right? And by the way, the reason why the lower range of the frequency spectrum actually looks more like Bouba and the higher range actually looks more like Kiki is because low notes vibrate at a slower rate than higher sounds. You may remember this from elementary school science class. So this shape is literally reflecting the waveform, not only the pitch, but how much high frequency or low frequency energy a sound has. But back to our Kiki Bouba spectrum, let's put some instruments on it in the frequency ranges that they usually occupy. So here we have a kick drum, a bass guitar, a synth that happens to be playing some synth strings. This is very important because keyboards in general can occupy a large range of frequencies, but this is especially true for synths because of the many different types of sounds they're able to produce. It could be a synth bass, for instance. Then we have our vocals, an electric guitar, and finally some hi-hats. Mixing is about making room for all of the instruments in your mix, making sure that they're not covering each other up or getting in each other's way and creating unnecessary buildup in certain frequency ranges, which can pull your ear and kind of take you out of the song because it's slightly uncomfortable. Now, let's talk about the first issue, having certain instruments cover each other up, which is also referred to as masking. The most classic example of this is the relationship between your bass and your kick. Because bass and kick are so close together on the frequency spectrum, they tend to interfere with each other. So what can you do? You can carve a little hole for your kick drum to be in your bass channel EQ, and carve a little hole for your bass to be in your kick drum EQ. So our kick drum is taking up this frequency, and our bass is taking up this frequency also, around 100 hertz. So I'll cut a little bit at 100 hertz in the bass and boost a little above it, about 200. And I'll do the inverse on our kick drum EQ. And now we've made a little bit more room for these instruments to play nice together. But there's another thing we can do, which is sidechain the bass to the kick. Now, there are a million tutorials out there already that will tell you how to do this in your respective DAWs, but basically what this is making it so that the bass turns down in volume every time the kick kicks, thus moving it out of the way and making the kick sound punchier. And even though we haven't actually touched the volume of the kick at all, it will appear louder and clearer. Because if you haven't found out already, you will soon find that sometimes no matter how loud you make the kick, it just doesn't seem to stand out enough because the bass is occupying those same frequencies, so they kind of just blend together. Let's look at our EQ spectrum again, and as much as I'd love to use a familiar song as an example, I don't want to get in trouble for copyright infringement, so I'm going to use one of my own songs, but please try this at home. Fly in any song you've been using as a reference track or just any song you love and think sounds great, because it will most likely be true for that one too. And if it's not, please let me know in the comments so that I can learn something from you. But generally, the frequency spectrum of your song will look something like this. With the Bouba side looking like it's peaking at a higher level than the Kiki side, which means it's technically louder in dB level, but our lowly human ears don't perceive it that way. Something you're gonna hear a lot of mix engineers say is that the mix needs to be balanced, but don't get obsessed with this visually. Don't try to get your Bouba side and your Kiki side to be the same height, because although this doesn't look balanced visually, it is sonically. See, it's okay for the Bouba side of the EQ to appear taller because we, and by we I mean we humans, perceive higher sounds as louder, even if they actually are lower in dB level, making certain frequencies feel quieter no matter what, regardless of how high in dB level they actually are. For example, let's say we play a bass note and an electric guitar note at the exact same volume. We are going to perceive the guitar note as louder. When I first started mixing, I was terrified of either having my mix be too dark or too bright. I thought that leaning to any direction of the spectrum would immediately reveal me as an amateur and make my mix sound unprofessional or whatever. It was my greatest fear. But the reality is there are plenty of mixes that lean a little darker or lean a little brighter, and plenty of instruments within those mixes that lean a little darker or a little brighter, depending on what the song calls for, and what the song calls for is up to the producer, which in this case is you. But how do you know what the song calls for? Well, let's go back to our instruments plotted along the Kiki Bouba spectrum and ask ourselves, what happens if the kick drum is too Bouba, or the hi-hat is too Kiki? Isn't the kick drum supposed to be Bouba? And isn't the hi-hat supposed to be Kiki? And how do you tell if something is too Kiki or too Bouba? Either if you can't hear it as well as you think you should, or you hear it too much to the point that it's uncomfortable. Let's say that you can hear your kick drum really well when you're listening to your mix on your studio monitors, but when you go and listen to it on your laptop or your phone, you can't hear it at all. That means you may need to make your kick drum more Kiki. Give some more energy to the attack or the beater sound of the kick drum instead of just the low end or subby register it might already have a lot going on in. And this is what I mean about perceived loudness. No matter how loud you turn up certain frequencies, i.e. bass, sub-bass, 60 hertz and below generally, they just won't cut through a mix. If anything, they'll muddy it up and weigh it down, covering up a lot of the other elements in the mix that you probably want your listeners to hear. What about hi-hats that are too Kiki? Yes, by their very nature, they're supposed to be Kiki, but maybe they're poking out too much. Maybe they're distracting or feeling too harsh, especially in the verses where there's less going on with the other instruments to cover it up. With a high cut filter, a little can go a long way in this situation, and you might not even have to do anything too drastic. Just tame the frequencies a bit. You might have to go more extreme than that too, but don't be afraid of doing that either. Sometimes what I like to do is go extreme so I can hear what I think is too extreme, and then dial it back, and then take the plugin off and see what it was like without it, and did I take too much out, blah, 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 back and forth until I find that sweet spot. And then I close my eyes and I turn on and off the EQ rapidly so that I lose track of whether it's enabled or not, and see if I can hear which one I like better. Because half of the time I do this, I'll have my eyes closed and think, wow, that really helped. And I open my eyes and it's off. Let's say we have our bass, and we can hear the melody of the bass line through a phone. But when we listen to it on our studio monitors, we want a little more of that woo-iness, like Cardi B's Bodak Yellow, for example. Maybe we don't want that much, but we want some. We want to feel the bass, not just hear the bass. All you gotta do is boost some of those Bouba frequencies, and if they're not really there are ways to artificially enhance them, which I'll talk about in the next episode. What about if your guitar is too Bouba? Same thing. We brighten that shit right up. Maybe we boost the high mids, maybe we cut the low mids, which by the way are the same thing if you do them the same exact amount. And my mastering engineer, Nick at Panorama Mastering, has a phenomenal video about this. But what if, instead of asking yourself whether you should boost or cut certain frequencies, you asked yourself, is this too Kiki or is this too Bouba?